In the first months of 1945, Japan was on the run. The Americans had fought their way across the Pacific. US submarines and aircraft had destroyed Japan's merchant fleet and naval air power. The main Japanese home islands had been cut off from vital supplies of fuel and raw materials. The Japanese were facing defeat. Yet they refused to surrender, convinced that if they fought back with sufficient brutality, the Americans wouldn't have the stomach for the fight and would give in. Japan made clear that every move towards the home islands would be paid for in Allied blood. It presented the United States with a huge problem. How could Japan be defeated without a terrible loss of American life? The country would eventually turn to the most powerful and dreadful weapon ever seen. A weapon that would change the course of war forever. In early 1945, as US military planners considered the next move against Japan, their gaze fell on the Japanese-occupied island of Iwo Jima. It lay a mere 800 miles from the Japanese mainland and would be a valuable base for attacking the country. The US commander in the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz, assembled the largest landing fleet ever brought together in the Pacific Campaign, and prepared to invade the island. Nimitz was taking no risks. Wave after wave of American aircraft paved the way with a massive aerial bombardment. Then, on the morning of February the 19th, 1945, the guns of the Naval Task Force began one of the most prolonged bombardments of the war. At the same time, landing craft set off for the shore. The Marines hit the beaches of Iwo Jima along the southwestern shore just after 9 o'clock in the morning. For a few moments there was an eerie calm. The massive naval and aerial bombardment appeared to have overwhelmed the Japanese garrison. Then a hurricane of Japanese fire swept over them. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander on the island, had told his men to hold their fire until the Americans were right under their guns. Now the Japanese opened up from a network of tunnels, caves and bunkers. There was carnage. But gradually, small groups of US troops inched their way forward. Finally, by the evening, the beachhead had been secured. The task now was to capture the 550-foot-high Mount Suribachi, the heavily defended volcano that dominates Iwo Jima. For 3 days, Marines clawed their way up the steep, pitted slopes. They were supported by a constant air and naval bombardment from the invasion fleet. Finally, on February the 23rd, 1945, a US platoon led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier began the final assault, carrying with them a small US flag. They reached the summit and raised their flag using a piece of piping as a pole. Marine Corps photographer Staff Sergeant Louis Lowery captured the scene with a few precious photographs. The hard-pressed Marines on the beaches below cheered and wept. Ships sounded their whistles. Three hours later, the event was restaged with a larger US flag. The moment was immortalized by photographer Joe Rosenthal with one of the most iconic photographs of the war. But the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. The rest of the island was still in Japanese hands. The next day, the Marines captured the first of the island's strategically vital airfields. But Kuribayashi had told his men to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Their duty to the Emperor to die on the island. It meant each assault became a bloody frontal affair. It took 2 weeks before the remaining 2 airfields on the island were in US hands. Even as the fighting continued, the US Air Force began to make use of Iwo Jima's airfields. During the late spring and summer of 1945, over 2,500 damaged US bombers made emergency landings on the island, often saving the lives of their crews. Finally, at the end of March, after some 6 weeks of ferocious fighting, the last Japanese resistance was snuffed out. But the capture of Iwo Jima had come at a terrible price. Only 200 of the 22,000-strong Japanese garrison survived. The Americans had also suffered badly. Nearly 7,000 Marines had been killed and some 18,000 wounded. The Americans finally had the base they needed, but it was now clear that unless the US could come up with an alternative, any invasion of Japan would be paid for in tens of thousands of American lives. In the United States, one group of military planners had long believed there was an alternative to invading Japan. It was called strategic bombing. This involved carefully targeted bombing raids designed to destroy Japan's infrastructure, industry, and ability to wage war. But in the first years of the Pacific War, there was a problem. Japan lay beyond the range of America's bombs. In April 1942, the US had managed to launch a one-off bombing raid on Tokyo. But it had pushed the bombers to their limits and was never a practical long-term option. Then, in early 1944, the Boeing Aircraft Corporation produced a revolutionary new heavy bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. It could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs over a range of 3,250 miles. Suddenly, Japan was just about in reach of America's forward bases in the Pacific. In summer 1944, 9 months before the assault on Iwo Jima, US B-29s stationed at Chengdu in southwest China began a series of strategic bombing raids on Japan. But range was still an issue. It was too far for a fighter escort, so the superfortresses had to fly alone, staying at high altitude for their own safety. Even then, the range was only just within limits, and there was no room for navigational error. Many of the bombs missed their targets. Then in July 1944, there was a development that gave strategic bombing a new lease of life. The US Navy captured the Mariana Islands in the Central Pacific. They were only 1,500 miles from the Japanese homeland. This was well within the B-29's operating range. The odds for a successful bombing campaign on Japan had dramatically improved. On November the 24th, over 100 superfortresses took off from the Marianas. Their target? The Nakajima Aircraft Factory in Tokyo. But only 48 bombs struck anywhere near the target. For 3 months, more raids targeted other industrial sites. But the B-29s were still flying without a fighter escort and still dropping their bombs from high altitude. The targets were often obscured by cloud, and jet stream winds made accurate bomb aiming impossible. To make matters worse, the B-29 suffered from engine problems. There were also attacks from kamikaze pilots. By the winter of 1944, it was clear that strategic bombing was just not working. If Japan was to be bombed into submission, the US would have to come up with something else. So it was that on December the 18th, 1944, America tried a new tactic. 84 B-29s set off from Chengdu for Japanese-occupied Hankow on the Yangtze River. They flew much lower than usual and carried mostly incendiary rather than high-explosive bombs. Hankow was devastated. The raid was more effective than almost any of the previous strategic bombing raids. The US appeared to have found a way forward: firebombing at low altitude. The US bomber commander in the Marianas, General Curtis LeMay, now ordered the systematic firebombing of Japan. It was the same tactic that Britain had employed in Germany. On the evening of March the 9th, 1945, Pathfinder aircraft roared over Tokyo, dropping incendiary target indicators. The fires they started marked the aiming points for almost 300 B-29s. Coming in at just 5,000 feet, they dropped over 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs. The flimsy wooden houses stood no chance. Air was sucked in, creating towering firestorms which raced faster than people could run. The glow from the burning city could be seen over 150 miles away. When the all clear finally sounded the following morning, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been obliterated. Over 100,000 of its citizens were killed and 1 million made homeless. Tokyo was not the only city to face this devastating new tactic. Nagoya was set ablaze 2 nights later. Then Osaka and Kobe during the following week. Firestorms engulfed whole areas, destroying houses and industrial facilities. But American success was coming at a price. Without escorts, the low-flying US bombers were dangerously vulnerable to Japanese fighters. American losses now mounted. If the bombing campaign was ever to succeed, the US needed bases even closer to Japan. Within weeks, Iwo Jima fell. Now, at last, the US Air Force not only had a base for its bombers within easy striking distance of Japan, it could finally use its Mustang fighters to escort them. During the late spring and early summer of 1945, strikes of up to 500 bombers attacked Japan every other day. Once the largest industrial areas had been crippled, LeMay moved on to lesser targets. Yet, in the face of catastrophic damage and an appalling death toll, the Japanese showed no sign of cracking. It finally dawned on the Americans that strategic bombing alone was never going to defeat Japan. It looked like a full-scale invasion of the country was becoming inevitable.
April Fool's Day 1945 dawned bright and clear in the East China Sea, as an armada of American warships and troop carriers assembled off the island of Okinawa. The fighting that was to follow the American landings on Okinawa was so savage that it prompted one witness to describe it as history's greatest madhouse. It also brought a new word to the English language, kamikaze, or suicide bomber. But there was method in the madness at Okinawa. For the American victory, achieved at a heavy cost in men and material, had been ensured by a remarkable secret war of code-breaking, which had begun in the 1930s. The Americans who had broken into the Japanese codes could share the credit with the soldiers, sailors, and airmen fighting in the front line. Theirs had been a long, clandestine battle with the enemy, which had dramatically shortened the war in the Pacific and saved many thousands of Allied lives. The road to war in the Far East and Pacific had begun back in the early 1930s. Under the rule of Emperor Hirohito, Japan enjoyed the highest standard of living in Asia. But its powerful military leaders were acutely aware that Japan lacked raw materials, coal, iron and oil, the basis of peacetime prosperity and also the sinews of war. There were only two ways to secure these assets, by trade or by military conquest. The Japanese chose military conquest. By 1932, its troops had turned the Chinese province of Manchuria into a Japanese colony and industrial base. The Chinese army was no match for the Japanese war machine. In 1933, the League of Nations demanded that the Japanese hand back Manchuria.
Japan, however, find it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese delegation's response was swift and dramatic. They walked out. In 1937, open war broke out between Japan and China. Within 6 months, the cities of Peking, Shanghai, and Nanking were in Japanese hands. Within 3 years, the Japanese controlled most of China's coastline and large tracts of the interior. The scale of Japan's conquests made a clash with the United States inevitable. But it was not until the autumn of 1940 that President Roosevelt served notice on the Japanese with an American embargo on rubber exports to Japan. In July 1941, this was followed by an oil embargo. With no natural resources of their own, the Japanese were placed in a rapidly tightening stranglehold. They were faced with a choice between a humiliating capitulation or the launching of all-out war to seize and hold the economic wealth of the Far East and Pacific. The Japanese chose war. While their diplomats continued to negotiate with the Americans in Washington, Japan's military chiefs were putting the finishing touches to detailed plans for the conquest of the Far East and Pacific. The plans were approved on the 3rd of November 1941. The die was now cast. The architect of the plans was the brilliant Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Paradoxically, Yamamoto was an admirer of the United States, where he'd served as a naval attaché in Washington. Yamamoto was keenly aware of the almost unlimited American economic power which would be unlocked by war. He warned the Emperor Hirohito that while he was confident of initial success, he could guarantee only 6 months of victory. Unknown to the Japanese, the Americans had gained a crucial advantage. They had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes. These were enciphered on a machine which resembled the German Enigma. The Americans had been able to reconstruct 4 machines, one of which they gave to the British. The cipher was codenamed Purple. But there was a crucial drawback to Purple. It was used by the Japanese Foreign Office solely for diplomatic communications. These did not contain the details of war plans. The intercepted Purple traffic was deeply ominous, but it did not reveal when and where the Japanese would strike. However, the airwaves were alive with another code of far greater importance than Purple, the Japanese Naval Book Code JN-25. JN-25 had been cracked by the British and Americans before Japan went to war, but the advantage this might have given the 2 future allies was wasted. The American codebreakers had shared information about Purple with their British counterparts. But the British did not inform the Americans that from the autumn of 1939, their codebreakers in the Far East and Australia had been routinely reading Japan's naval signals. So too had teams working at the nerve center of British wartime codebreaking, the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, where the German Enigma code had also been cracked. Meanwhile, in Washington, US Navy codebreakers had also found their way into JN-25. But the head of the Navy's War Plans Division, Admiral Richmond K. Turner, was as fiercely jealous of the Navy's breakthrough as the British codebreakers. He did not even inform President Roosevelt. As time ran out, the Japanese were readying themselves for war. 10 years of experience in China had hardened every branch of their combat forces. A vital component in the overall Japanese plan was the destruction of the US Navy's Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor on Hawaii, by a surprise carrier-borne attack. The Japanese strike force tasked with the attack on Pearl Harbor assembled secretly in the Kurili Islands, off the northeast coast of Japan. It sailed to its standing-off position on the 25th of November. Radio silence was observed. Radio silence, but not complete radio silence. In the days leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, at least 20 messages sent by Yamamoto to the strike force and encoded in JN-25 were intercepted by American and British listening stations. The signals confirmed that the force contained aircraft carriers. An intercept on the 2nd of December indicated the day of a planned attack, the 7th. The British deduced that the target was Pearl Harbor. The information was relayed to London, and there it stayed. In America, similar pointers to the attack on Pearl Harbor remained stuck in the lower reaches of naval intelligence. Roosevelt and the senior officers in command at Pearl Harbor remained in the dark. The 7th of December promised to be another relaxed peacetime Sunday. But in the pre-dawn light, 200 miles from Hawaii, the Japanese carrier pilots and navigators had received their final briefing. The moment for which they had trained so hard had arrived. The first wave of bombers and their fighter escorts was readied for takeoff. They arrived over Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. Below the dive and torpedo bombers, the US Pacific Fleet lay completely defenseless, the capital ships lashed together in battleship row. They were sitting targets. Eight battleships, 3 cruisers and several smaller ships were either sunk or badly damaged in the attack. 300 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Japanese had lost just 30 aircraft and 5 small submarines which had tried to penetrate the harbor. But none of the Pacific Fleet's carriers was in Pearl Harbor when the attack went in, and it was the carrier, not the battleship, which would decide the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The Japanese victory was incomplete. For President Roosevelt, the agony of waiting was now over. The following day, he announced,
"A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire."
In the aftermath of the disaster at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy covered its tracks over the deciphering of JN-25. Later, it would claim that the code had not been broken until after Pearl Harbor. But access to it would loom ever larger in the unfolding Pacific War. Neither the Americans nor the colonial powers in the Far East were in any way prepared to stem the Japanese blitzkrieg which followed the attack on Pearl Harbor. For 6 months, the Japanese ran riot. The British were swept out of Malaya and Singapore. The Americans were driven out of the Philippines. The Japanese pursued the retreating British through Burma to the frontier of India. The Western powers had fatally underestimated the skill, strength, and coordination of the Japanese armed forces. In far less than Yamamoto's forecast of 6 months of victory, his men had created a Pacific empire which threatened Alaska to the north, India to the west, and Australia in the south. Its conquered peoples now became part of Japan's greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But Yamamoto, a strategic visionary, knew that in drawing the United States into the conflict, the Japanese had roused a sleeping giant. He now had to face the consequences of his grim prediction to his emperor. To secure his perimeter, Yamamoto planned to provoke a decisive naval encounter by seizing Midway Island, an outlier of Pearl Harbor held by the Americans. But the Japanese remained unaware that the Americans were reading JN-25, the Navy's principal operational code, on an increasingly regular basis. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy Listening and Decoding Station in Hawaii, codenamed HIPO, was assigned a key role in deciphering JN-25. The sheer size of the Pacific theater ensured that there was no shortage of material on which to work. By the early summer of 1942, about 60% of Japanese traffic was being intercepted, of which half was analyzed in depth. In command at HIPO was Lieutenant Commander Joseph J. Rochefort, a man with a photographic memory for names, signals, and dates. Rochefort's genius lay in being able to form a picture from a jumble of seemingly unrelated facts. The Americans called their decrypts Ultra, the same code name that the British used for the ultra-secret information they derived from the breaking of the German Enigma codes. Both allies also adopted similar rules for operational use of this material. Field commanders were provided with a cover story, which could disguise where the information had come from. Like the Germans, the Japanese never realized that their codes had been broken. Every reverse was put down to other reasons, often the cover stories concocted by the Allies. It was the critical secret of the war. The Japanese made their first move to crush the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the beginning of May 1942. They had been stung by the raid on mainland Japan flown by 16 Mitchell bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. The Japanese High Command decided to implement Yamamoto's Midway proposal. First, however, they proceeded with their plans to extend the footholds they'd gained in New Guinea by putting troops ashore near Port Moresby. And they continued with their air raids on the port of Darwin in northern Australia. These were a reminder of how close the Japanese had come to cutting the Australians' lines of communication with the United States. Throughout April 1942, hypo decrypts were building a picture of Japanese plans to mount a large operation in the area of Port Moresby. The Japanese were threatening to move against Port Moresby and the island of Tulagi in the South Solomons. On the 27th of April, there was a change in the Japanese call signs. This was a development which the American eavesdroppers recognized as an almost certain indication that an operation was about to be launched. The Pacific Fleet was alerted to the impending Japanese strikes on Port Moresby and Tulagi. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, ordered Admiral Fitch's Task Force 11, with the carrier Lexington, 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers, south from Pearl Harbor. They were to rendezvous with Task Force 17, commanded by Admiral Fletcher in the carrier Yorktown, in the Coral Sea approaches west of the New Hebrides. The arrival of American carriers in the area came as a great shock to the Japanese. But it was not until the 8th of May that both sides located the other's carriers and launched strikes. The ensuing battle was the first in which the opposing fleets never caught sight of each other, but did battle instead with the enemy's carrier-borne aircraft. The Americans lost Lexington. Badly damaged by a Japanese strike, she had to be sunk by American torpedoes. But Lexington had not been lost in vain. The Japanese carrier Shoho had also been sunk, and the Japanese drive on Australia halted. The American carrier air groups were also reassured that they were the equal of the enemy. Above all, the Battle of the Coral Sea silenced any lingering doubts about the vital importance of communications intelligence and the work of Station Hypo. Yorktown, which had been damaged at Coral Sea, was repaired at Pearl Harbor in just 2 days. On the 20th of May, she sailed to join the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, both new to carrier combat, for the decisive encounter off the island of Midway. Yamamoto's Midway operation, codenamed MI, was to go ahead as planned. It was to be linked with an operation to seize the Western Aleutians. The seizure of the Aleutians would anchor the northern end of Japan's defensive perimeter. The occupation of Midway would give the Japanese an advanced warning and defense post at the western edge of the Hawaiian chain. Yamamoto calculated that this would provoke a decisive confrontation with the Pacific Fleet. Tight Japanese radio security left Rochefort's team at Hypo groping in the dark for a sign of the enemy's intentions. There were plenty of JN-25 decrypts, but they gave no indication of Yamamoto's targets. But Rochefort had a hunch that the main target was Midway Island. He estimated that the attack on Midway would be launched on or about the 3rd of June. However, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet, Admiral King, disagreed. He believed that the Japanese were planning to hit the west coast of America itself in the middle of June. Rochefort devised a scheme to provide incontrovertible proof that Hypo was right. He set a trap for the Japanese. He instructed the garrison at Midway to send a radio message in clear that it was running out of water. It was an innocuous administrative message which Rochefort believed would not arouse Japanese suspicion. The enemy swallowed the bait. An Australian outpost of the Hypo network intercepted a Japanese signal which indicated that AF, the as yet unknown target of MI, had reported a shortage of fresh water. Rochefort's ruse had revealed the Japanese target. Later decrypt showed that MI would take place on the 4th of June. As the garrison prepared, Task Forces 16 and 17 sailed to position themselves northeast of Midway to await the Japanese. It was the most stunning intelligence coup in the history of naval warfare. Nimitz himself had always believed that the Japanese target was Midway. He also appreciated that the Aleutians element of the operation was a sideshow. It was at Midway that the outcome of the Pacific War was to be decided. On the 3rd of June, a Catalina flying boat from Midway spotted the Japanese invasion fleet heading towards the island. Rochefort had been vindicated. But Rochefort could not determine the outcome of the battle. The Japanese had the advantage in carriers, 4-3, but now they lacked all advantage of surprise. The US Navy was far closer to Midway than they had anticipated. In an extraordinary 5 minutes during the Battle of Midway, one Japanese carrier was sunk and two so badly damaged that they had to be abandoned. This was a new form of naval warfare, in which a strike from the sky could destroy an enemy fleet within minutes. A Japanese strike from their one remaining carrier, Hiryu, was launched against Yorktown. The attack reopened the wounds which the Japanese had inflicted at Coral Sea. The stricken Yorktown had to be abandoned. The same fate was suffered by Hiryu the next morning, when American dive bombers caught up with her. Within the space of a few minutes on the 4th of June 1942, the American carriers had ripped the heart out of the Japanese combined fleet. The Japanese dream of empire went down with their carriers at Midway. The Japanese now had to defend a vast ocean empire which might be attacked at any point by the gathering might of the American war machine. Yamamoto's prediction was unreeling, and the American response was not long in coming. The point the Americans chose was the Solomon's Chain. On the 7th of August 1942, US Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were building an airfield. The capture and occupation of the airfield, named Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at Midway, sparked a series of savage land, air and sea battles for Guadalcanal. The Japanese were not ejected from Guadalcanal until February 1943. Just before Midway, the Japanese had switched to a new naval code. JN-25C, and then another, JN-25D. At a critical moment, the American code-breaking effort was plunged into the dark. This setback had been anticipated, and much vital information was sweated from traffic analysis, including the identification of individual Japanese radio men by their distinctive keying styles. This could not provide the lightning flashes of insight which underpinned the victory at Midway, but it played a vital part in the Guadalcanal campaign. But another intelligence triumph lay just around the corner. On the 3rd of April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto had flown from Truk in the Carolines Group to the great Japanese supply base at Rabaul in New Britain. Traffic analysis quickly revealed Yamamoto's presence in Rabaul and his interest in the airfields at the southern end of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. Hypo had been renamed FUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. Now it intercepted and deciphered a series of messages sent in Japanese Army and Navy codes which revealed Yamamoto's movements. Yamamoto was to make a tour of inspection in the Western Solomons. He would be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, codenamed Betty by the Allies, with only a small escort. Admiral Nimitz decided to order the assassination of his Japanese opposite number. He sent an eyes-only message to Admiral William E. Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, asking him if Yamamoto could be intercepted and shot down. Yamamoto's first stop at the south of Bougainville was just within range of American fighters flying from Guadalcanal. Halsey confirmed that the mission could be flown by Lockheed P-38 fighters. His only reservation was the risk of betraying to the Japanese the fact that their codes had been broken. There could be no cover story for this operation. The decision went right to the top, to the White House and President Roosevelt. On the 15th of April 1943, the President gave his assent to Operation Vengeance. In the Solomons, Yamamoto's subordinates were worried about the risk he was taking and made several attempts to dissuade him from setting off on his tour of inspection. But Yamamoto refused to change his plans. At this stage in the war, his mood was one of weary fatalism. At 6 a.m. on the 18th of April, Yamamoto prepared to take off from Rabaul in his Betty. 6 Zeros were to escort his aircraft and a second carrying his staff. On Guadalcanal, the interception of 2 encoded weather reports indicated that Yamamoto's tour was about to begin. 16 P-38s of 339th Fighter Squadron were readied. Yamamoto's plane was cheered to the echo as it took off from Rabaul. On Guadalcanal, 4 of the P-38s were tasked with shooting down Yamamoto. The rest were to fly cover. The pilots had been told that the information about Yamamoto's movements had been supplied by Australian coast watchers. Flying nearly all the way at wave-top height, the P-38s intercepted their target and his escort at 9:35 a.m. off the island of Bougainville. In the dogfight which erupted, 4 of the Zeros were shot down by the cover group, while the other Lightnings went to work. The Japanese bombers stood no chance. The aircraft carrying Yamamoto plunged into the jungle, killing everyone on board. All but one of the P-38s returned home safely. Exactly 12 months had passed since the Doolittle raid on mainland Japan. Yamamoto had met a warrior's death in a cause he knew was doomed. It was a terrible blow to Japanese morale. Yamamoto was given a state funeral, the first bestowed on a commoner since the death of Admiral Tojo, the founder of the modern Japanese Navy. But its high command remained supremely confident that their naval codes were safe from Allied eyes. The Americans were now island-hopping their way across the Pacific. The Japanese stronghold of Rabaul had been isolated and left to wither on the vine as the advance flowed around and past it. New amphibious weapons and tactics enabled the US Marine Corps to use the islands and atolls in their path as stepping stones towards mainland Japan. Resistance to the American Pacific Drive was fanatical. But as Yamamoto had feared, the sheer scale on which the Americans were prepared to wage war in this vast theater of operations was irresistible. In June 1944, remaining Japanese naval air power was broken in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Its carriers survived, but not their aircraft. The triumphant Japanese strategy of 1941 had been turned inside out. Now they were enfeebled by poor intelligence and the inability to concentrate their forces against the hammer blows delivered by the Americans. As they approached the Japanese home islands, the Americans encountered ever fiercer resistance. The Japanese warrior code of Bushido decreed that victory or death were the only honorable ends to battle. On Saipan, in the Marianas, thousands of Japanese troops sought death in suicidal charges. The Marianas gave the Americans a springboard from which to launch B-29 attacks on Japanese war industry. Here was the ultimate wartime application of aviation technology and industrial muscle. Midway between the Marianas and Japan lay the small volcanic outcrop of Iwo Jima. Honeycombed with elaborate fortifications and manned by 23,000 troops, Iwo Jima's airfields made it an essential objective in the American advance. After a massive preliminary bombardment, the assault went in on the morning of the 19th of February. One war correspondent described the fight for Iwo Jima as the worst battle he had ever seen, one in which men died with the greatest possible violence. Barely 200 of the island's defenders were prepared to surrender. Iwo Jima provided an awful warning of what lay ahead for the Americans on the island of Okinawa, their next objective midway between Formosa and Japan. The invasion fleet assembled with the knowledge that the fight for Iwo Jima had cost 7,000 dead and 20,000 wounded. The commanders planning the operation were determined to take no chances. Okinawa is an island 70 miles long and 8 miles wide. Behind its beaches lay steep and treacherous terrain held by nearly 70,000 Japanese troops. Beginning on the 24th of March 1945, the Americans delivered the heaviest air and naval bombardment of the Pacific War. After a week, 30,000 heavy-caliber shells and thousands more bombs had been poured into the landing areas. On the 1st of April, the American Armada disgorged 2 Marine and 2 Army divisions, which raced ashore in their landing craft while 18 battleships sent shells whistling over their heads. They were the first of 170,000 men of the US 10th Army committed to the capture of Okinawa. The Americans anticipated that they would meet fierce resistance at the water's edge, but the Japanese commander, General Mitsuru Ushijima, had decided to allow the Americans to land virtually unopposed and then draw them into a battle of attrition against a series of defense lines in the island's interior. The Americans had landed in the central waist of the island to seize its airfield and then split Okinawa in two halves. The Japanese had withdrawn to their defense lines, determined to inflict the maximum punishment on 10th Army. The island was a warren of tunnels and firing positions, many of which concealed heavy-caliber weapons. General Ushijima had another weapon which had already been used against the first American thrusts towards Okinawa. They were the kamikazes, suicide pilots who took their name from the storm which had wrecked the Mongol invasion fleet in the 13th century. Now the latter-day kamikazes flew through a storm of fire to crash their planes laden with explosives on the decks of American warships. Bushido provided the psychological underpinning of the kamikazes, but they were also creatures of necessity. By late 1944, the Japanese Naval Air Force had been shredded by American air power. There were few experienced pilots left. The advantage of kamikaze tactics was that they could be performed accurately by raw pilots in any kind of aircraft. The kamikazes were hard to stop, as the incoming aircraft had to be completely destroyed for the warship to avoid damage. And American carriers with their wooden decks were particularly vulnerable to the kamikazes. Like the samurai they emulated, the kamikaze pilots were given the hachimaki, a folded white cloth tied around the head and intended to keep the warrior's eyes clear of hair and sweat. Before their mission, the young pilots wrote last letters, enclosing relics like locks of hair. Then they took a purifying cup of sake. One of them wrote, "I have been given a splendid opportunity to die. I shall fall like a blossom from a radiant cherry tree." These were the young men who would be thrown against the American invasion fleet at Okinawa. They had already given the Americans a taste of what lay in store for them when Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark A. Mitscher, had raided the inland sea on the 18th of March as a preliminary to the Okinawa landings. The kamikazes had flown into a wall of fire which destroyed 200 aircraft. But they kept on coming. Amongst the carriers, Wasp was badly damaged by a kamikaze and had been saved only by heroic firefighting. 2 conventional bombs created an inferno on Franklin, which took the lives of 724 of her crew. After landing, the 1st and 6th Marines turned to clear the north of the island before joining the 7th and 96th Divisions in the battle for the south. On the 9th of April, the US 4th Corps had run into the Shuri Line, blocking the southern tip of Okinawa. The advance to the Shuri Line was the prelude to one of the most brutal slogging matches in the Pacific War. The Americans had to fight their way across terrain pockmarked with trenches and bunkers. The few of the enemy surrendered. Most of them fought to the last. Successive ridgelines reduced the advance to a crawl, but the land commander, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, stuck rigidly to his methodical tactics. The weather broke up as torrential rain blew in from the South China Sea. The ground became a quagmire in which men and machines slithered to a halt. At sea, the invasion fleet, lying off Okinawa, was assailed by wave after wave of kamikazes. The Japanese High Command had ordered a coordinated attack codenamed Heaven 1. On the 7th of April, 700 aircraft, many of them obsolescent and half of them kamikazes, attacked the invasion fleet. On that day, the Japanese lost almost half their aircraft, but sank 3 destroyers, a tank landing craft, and 2 ammunition ships. This was not the return which the Japanese High Command had hoped for. But on the 11th of May, 2 kamikazes hit the carrier Bunker Hill within the space of 3 minutes. Nearly 400 men died. Some kamikaze pilots flew Oka, cherry blossom, rocket-powered missiles. Launched from the belly of a bomber, they carried a 2,600-pound warhead and struck home at 600 miles per hour. An American fighter filmed the missile and its carrier. Lumbering through the air, they presented a perfect target. At sea level, the American response was to thicken the screen of radar picket destroyers lying off Okinawa at ranges of up to 100 miles. As the British task force discovered during the Falklands War, the radar screen's mission is essentially sacrificial. The incoming enemy aircraft readily attack these targets rather than the heavier units nearer the landing beaches. Between the 6th of April and the 29th of July, 14 American destroyers were sunk by the kamikazes. In addition to Bunker Hill, 2 more carriers, Enterprise and Hancock, suffered severe damage. The strain on the Okinawa invasion fleet was mounting, along with the death toll claimed by the kamikazes. In contrast, the 4 British carriers assigned to Task Force 57 fared better. Their flight decks were armoured, as a precaution against the shell fire likely to be encountered in narrower European waters. These carriers survived kamikaze attacks without serious damage. Meanwhile, far to the north, Japan's last operational surface force, the giant battleship Yamato, escorted by a cruiser and 8 destroyers, had set sail from Japan. Yamato was to be the biggest kamikaze of them all. She had fuel only for a one-way trip to Okinawa. But Yamato was detected long before she came within range of the landings. At noon on the 7th of April, she came under attack by 300 American carrier-borne aircraft. She had no air cover and was hit by 6 torpedoes, which knocked out her steering. Yamato sank after 2 hours of punishment, taking with her all but a handful of her crew of 2,300. Okinawa, the Americans were locked in a bitter step-by-step battle. Buckner had now come under heavy pressure to make an amphibious landing behind the Japanese lines, but he continued to batter away at the fighting front. William Manchester, then a young Marine, later a distinguished journalist, wrote of the fighting, "You could smell the front long before you saw it. It was one vast cesspool. It was hideous, and it was also strangely familiar, resembling photographs of 1914-18. The two great armies squatting opposite one another in mud and smoke were locked together in unimaginable agony." The battle reached a climax on the 14th of May, when the Marines launched an attack on a hill known as the Sugarloaf, on the approaches to the ancient fortress of Shuri. In the struggle, nearly 3,000 Marines were killed. Few of their enemies surrendered. Shuri was abandoned, and Ushijima pulled the remnants of his garrison out of his last defense line. The rubble-choked ruins of Shuri Castle were taken by the Marines on the 29th. But still, the Japanese fought on. They were now squeezed into a precipitous ridge 3 miles from the southern tip of the island. The Americans dubbed it the Big Apple. This last redoubt claimed the life of General Buckner, hit by shrapnel in the front line. He was buried on the island with his troops. The Americans had lost 12,500 dead and 36,000 wounded. The carnage had been unrelenting. During the final days, some 4,000 Japanese troops did surrender. But many had to be killed in their bunkers, bringing the final Japanese death toll to 110,000. All the Japanese senior officers, including Ushijima, had committed suicide. Those who survived were in a state of shock. Over 5,000 men of the US Navy had been killed by the kamikazes, and 38 ships sunk. But to achieve this, the Japanese had sacrificed nearly 1,000 kamikaze aircraft. During the battle, as many as a quarter of Okinawa's civilian population died in the fighting. American troops were appalled to see how many civilians were prepared to commit suicide. The American military calculated that an invasion of mainland Japan might cost them 250,000 dead. And evidence was mounting that the Japanese intended to use their whole population as kamikazes. On designated beaches around the coastline, the invasion forces would have been confronted with a tidal wave of civilians armed with primitive weapons. It was the strategy of despair. It was this horrendous prospect which made the United States decide to use its most terrible weapon. Two atomic bombs, dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, led to the Japanese surrender on the 15th of August, 1945. Paradoxically, the bombs may have saved hundreds of thousands of Japanese as well as American lives.